Education in Detroit and the region. How can more schools make the grade and more students succeed? We'll take a look at the challenges, the progress, and the future. From funding to governance to student achievement, we'll tackle it all. MiWeek is live tonight for our special coverage on the state of education.
From the moment you wake up till you turn out the light, MASCO is proud to be part of your everyday life. When you turn on the faucet for a cool drink of water, open a kitchen cabinet to set the family table, or freshen up a room with a new coat of paint, you do it all with MASCO products. MASCO and its family of companies, serving Michigan communities since 1929.
Did you know Gordon Food Service was started by a 23-year-old entrepreneur as a butter and egg delivery business more than a century ago? In 1948, school teacher Gerard Wendell Hayworth borrowed $10,000 from his parents to start a woodworking operation in his family's garage. It's now Hayworth Incorporated. These are just some of the ways Michigan's pioneers started out as small companies with big ideas.
We are business leaders for Michigan. We are committed to making Michigan a top 10 state for jobs, personal income, and a healthy economy. Funding is also provided by Delta.
And welcome to MiWeek. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Christy McDonald. We are live and on the road tonight in Detroit for a special hour-long show talking about education in Detroit and the surrounding region. We're at Cass Technical High School on 2nd Avenue, ranked among the top 5% of schools in Michigan. And our conversation tonight will focus on successes in education like at Cass Tech, as well as the challenges faced in Detroit and other districts across the state. We'll hear from the people who have the most at stake: parents and students, administrators and teachers. Plus, we have an audience with us tonight. They'll get a chance to get in on the discussion as well. And make sure you tell us what you think on Twitter and on Facebook during the show at MiWeek. We'll be checking that as well. So let's get started with our MiWeek contributors. Nolan Finley of the Detroit News, Stephen Henderson of the Detroit Free Press. Hey guys, it's good to see you. And I gotta say, the Cass Tech Auditorium is amazing. Fabulous. Here. We're sitting here tonight. Yeah, you know, and I'm glad that we have, I think what is really an interesting backdrop for a conversation about education, which I'd argue is the most important thing that we should have on our agenda here in the state of Michigan in this coming year, Nolan.
What else matters? And unfortunately, we are still not a state that values education. We're not, either our political leaders or our people. I mean, we aren't demanding better. Other states have decided everybody's going to pull together, set aside their interests, set aside, you know, the turf wars, and work together on a cohesive plan to improve education in their state. I'm talking about places like Massachusetts, Tennessee, Florida, where they decided on a single plan where they're all pulling together. We haven't even decided here on the outline of a reform plan. We're still fighting. We're still, you know, we still got the politicians and the unions and everybody else pulling for pieces of the education pie here, and nobody's really focused on the fact we're failing our children big time in this state.
You know, I think I agree with you saying that we need a cohesive plan, but I would say that there are people that are fighting every day that maybe that don't have their voices heard in terms of what they would like to see coming up in our state.
Yeah, you have a real disconnect between what you're talking about and the leadership. The leadership in the governor's office, the leadership at the state board and the superintendent, the leadership in the legislature. That's where we are being failed, and increasingly the pressure is on local school districts, parents, teachers, administrators to try to find their way to something better without that leadership at the top. And that's, I mean, it's ridiculous to start with. Other states are doing better, but it's also really unfair.
Well, I think it's a very difficult task as well. So we're going to be talking about Michigan as a whole, but we are going to be concentrating on Detroit here, doing this show live in Detroit. You know, a lot of focus is on the new Detroit Public Schools Community District since the legislature passed that $617 million aid package to pay off the debt. So now we're in the school year. How will the finances work in the district? Where is the money being spent? What are some of the changes in the classroom? And what can students and parents expect this year? Well, we sat down this week with Interim Superintendent Alycia Meriweather.
In the past years, we've basically had to take $1,100 off of the top of the per pupil allocation to pay debt, and that is not happening this year. So that's great. Another thing that is good news, if you would put it in that category, is we also received about $25 million to invest, and the district chose to invest those in academic programs, safety, and facilities. And then, of course, a piece of that is put aside for cash flow. So our first payment from the state comes in October, and so to make sure that we have smooth sailing until that October date, we've set aside some of that money to get us to that SAN payment, or the state aid note payment.
It is a year of change at the Detroit Public Schools Community District. There are new programs like tuition-free Montessori and shared learning classes. And this summer, DPS worked on a new academic plan to move the district forward with the help of teachers, administrators, and principals.
The 5 pillars are literacy, innovation, career pathways, wraparound services, and family and community. So those 5 pillars basically are what we're saying everything that happens in the district needs to be aligned with. Let's just take innovation as one of the pillars. What I'm hoping is that as the district, we really look at ways to remove barriers to innovation. And that goes all the way down to a classroom example. When people in classrooms and in schools feel so constrained by regulations and by expectations and by requirements that they feel that they cannot branch out in creative ways that they think will be better for their students or better for their school, we really do a disservice. And so what I would hope that people believe is that that pillar of innovation is not just a district concept. It actually should apply to the school level and to the classroom level. And I really would like to see people moving forward and thinking of creative ways to teach content.
Meriweather wants to put a focus on reading, supply students with free books to keep, and pushing assignments that go beyond the textbook.
In many ways, textbooks, as soon as they're printed, are fairly archaic. And so we need to be shifting towards problem solving, critical thinking, and using assignments that actually stretch kids' brains in ways that help them think strategically and critically with those 21st century skills.
What happens in the classroom is one thing, but DPS has struggled with miserable building conditions that made national news after teacher sickouts called attention to the problems. Meriweather says 87 out of 93 buildings are now up to code, and more money is being used to start fixing the others.
We're talking about school buildings with 30, 50 classrooms, offices, bathrooms, windows. You know, all of these things take resources, and so we've got to be very conscientious and very focused about how we use the resources we have, and then figure out how to leverage additional resources to get that work done. You cannot just say, we're going to make lesson plans great, and the schools are going to get great. This is so complex. The schools sit within the city context. The school sits within the community. The school sits within the neighborhood. And so whatever's happening in the neighborhood also has to be considered as we're moving this district forward. I've been asked the question, you know, what is your response to students leaving the city to go to schools outside of the city? My response is we need to be focused on being the best, because when you're the best, you don't worry about people going elsewhere. And so my hope is that we continue on this journey towards excellence, and that while I sit in this role as interim superintendent, that I figure out as many ways as possible to remove barriers that would prevent excellence, and then really help drill down resources and support to encourage excellence, and to make sure that what we're offering at every single school is the very best education possible.
And Alycia Meriweather gives credit to the staff this year. She also says the district is addressing class size that people have complained about as they settle in these first few weeks. And she is also looking forward to the community engaging and voting when it's time to pick a school board this November. All right, let's go now to Stephen and his panel of guests. Stephen?
Yeah, I'm here with Tonya Allen, who is the president and CEO of the Skillman Foundation, Armen Hratchian, a vice president at Excellent Schools Detroit, and Veronica Conforme, who's Chancellor of the Education Achievement Authority of Michigan. Welcome to the show, guys.
Thanks, David.
Yeah, Tonya, I want to start with you. It seems like in Detroit, in particular, we are not where we were, but we are not where we want to be right now. There's a lot of, I think, question and disappointment still surrounding the circumstances of this new district going forward. But I'm curious what makes you optimistic that it might actually work?
Well, I'm optimistic for a couple of reasons. First, I think that we have a set of really strong educators that are in our city. And if they're enabled and they're taking the bureaucracy and the burdens are unleashed from them, then I think that they can do a really good job. The second is, I think that this fight that we had with Lansing to make sure that we could reset the education system in Detroit to make it effective really has, I think, woken up our public. And so I think there are lots of civic leaders as well as parents and just community members in general who are really interested in stepping up now and figuring out how you fix this, because everybody knows that what the legislature did was just pitiful.
Yeah.
It was pitiful in the sense that they didn't solve the problem, yet they spent more than $500 million.
Right.
And so—
And now they're hanging that over our heads saying, we spent $500 million, don't blow it.
Right,
as if that was the only thing that we needed.
Right, so I'm very hopeful about that. So I actually think that Lansing believes that we probably left, that we didn't get everything we wanted. We were gonna run with our tails between our legs, and they're wrong, because they don't know Detroit, and they don't know Detroiters. And so I'm ready for the next battle, because we're gonna win this, because it's important for our children, and that's why I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful because of the determination, the grit, the resilience of Detroiters, and we will not take this, you know, we won't take what they're trying to give to us, or more importantly, we're not going to take what they're trying to give to our children. We deserve better.
Right. Armen, ESD has done a lot of work just sort of quantifying the challenges that we have in Detroit, looking at the differences between schools that exist under different kinds of governance. Talk about what that data tells us about what we need to be focused on right now.
Yeah. Well, you know, first of all, we talk about education in Detroit, and post-legislation, everybody remains focused on Detroit public schools, which is a huge need and the largest single institution. But the large majority of kids in Detroit today attend charter schools or leave for the suburbs every day. Part of this legislation was the Detroit Education Commission, and that got wrapped up in this school choice debate. And I think if you take a step back from this charter DPS fight that everybody wants to go to, you realize that even today, you know, parents are struggling to navigate all of these choices.
And there aren't enough quality ones.
And there aren't enough quality ones. There are 4 schools in the city of Detroit that are above the 50th percentile statewide. The state reform office, which now has authority over accountability for the city, you know, legislators said we want you to take responsibility, but then they held accountability at the state level, so here we go again. They released this list. There are 71 schools in Detroit that are on the bottom 5%, but we don't talk about there's an additional 80 schools that are between 5th percentile and 20th percentile. So 3/4 of the schools in the city of Detroit are performing in the bottom quarter, and that's why every time we went to Lansing or had these conversations, we said, this has to be a comprehensive solution. This has to be a comprehensive solution that puts families and students first. And, you know, unfortunately—
Forget about what we call the schools.
Yeah.
They're all in need of the same kind of—
That's right, that's right. And promoting quality over and over and over. So I agree with Tonya, we're still focused on that issue, and we'll remain focused on that issue.
Veronica, you had a district of really struggling schools. The 15 lowest performing schools over a long period of time were sort of put together in the EAA. Lots of fits and starts in the sort of early years of that system. Talk about where it can go now, and also talk a little bit about where it's gotten to. I mean, one of the things that gets lost is these were very, very low performing schools, but we're starting to see the germs of progress.
Right, right. And I think, you know, we have to acknowledge that this was not started in any ideal circumstances. It was in very much imposed in some ways. Yeah. It was probably didn't have enough time to develop the concept well, and was fraught with lots of challenges that we have seen play out in the media. Yeah. However, over the past 2 years, a lot of focus and attention around what is most important, which is teaching and learning and creating good schools. So we have teams of educators that we've recruited and invested and developed and coached to do the very hard work of turning around the lowest performing schools. And we're starting to see some results. 7 out of 9 schools and showed improvement this year in ELA, and 8 out of 9 in math. Are we where we need to be? Absolutely not. It's a step in the right direction. We've created small learning environments. We know the things that work. We know intimate relationships with students and families is what works. Yeah. We know that focused curriculum and attention and consistency over time, not a new plan every year, right. Consistency and opportunity to build year over year on that work is what is required in these schools, and we've seen it happen across the country. We can do it here. Yeah.
And we don't want to stop talking about this without mentioning funding, right? Money. We need money to do the things that we all know need to be done in schools that have populations like these, really distressed populations that need more, not less.
I think we need money. I think we need better coordination. I think about the fact that many of our students have different homes 2 and 3 times in our year. About 30% of our population moves consistently. That means that we need different coordination. We need to do things substantially differently so that we can actually meet their needs.
Yeah. Tonya, before we wrap, I want to ask you about the very important decisions we'll be making here in Detroit in November. Who is going to sit on the school board? This will be the first time in, 7 years that we'll have a school board that's not really, that is in control of a lot of the district. What kind of things are you seeing in those races among the candidates, again, that make you hopeful? I have seen a lot of people in those ranks who I think, wow, that's great that person is interested in this, is putting in the time and effort, and wants to help us get going in the right direction.
Yeah, I'm very hopeful about the school board elections, largely because of the same thing you said. We have really talented people who have decided to run for school board. Many of them are proven administrators, many of them proven educators. So one of the things that I'm most pleased about is the number of educators who have put their hats in the ring, and they want to bring their skill set. But I think one of the things that's really interesting is that you see that these school board candidates are combining their talents together on a couple of slates, trying to figure out like how we really get a strong block of people who are going to be focused on the right things. And we hosted, the Skillman Foundation hosted a session for the school board candidates to learn about the district, and nearly half of them showed up for every single session. So that just really speaks to the quality of these candidates and their desire to make a difference.
Yeah. And that gets back to what you were talking about initially, this resilience of Detroiters saying, all right, we didn't win the way we wanted to, but that doesn't mean we're going to go away. We're going to keep pushing, keep fighting to make the schools better.
Absolutely.
All right, guys, thanks very much for being here.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Back to Christy.
All right, thanks, Stephen. You know, tonight's program is a joint effort with One Detroit and the media outlets in the Detroit Journalism Cooperative. And all of this year, the DJC is examining whether Detroiters are better off today than during the 1967 Detroit Rebellion. And while looking at the current state of education, we found that school suspensions and expulsions have risen dramatically, especially for African American students. Take a look.
14-year-old Keyshawn Winfield has been playing football since he was 5.
He plays 4 different positions in football, and he loves it, and he's good with his teammates, and they have a good rapport. He has a good rapport with his coaches.
On the field, Keyshawn excels. In school, it's a different story.
So Mom had, about 10 meetings last school year?
Yes.
Danielle Flint is a child advocate working with Keyshawn and his mother, Alycia Sewell.
And there are so many events, incident 1, incident 2, incident 3. 4, 5, 6.
Suspensions lasting 2 days, 3 days, 5, 10. So many suspensions, he missed 60 days of school altogether. Now Keyshawn has to repeat 7th grade. Diagnosed with oppositional defiance disorder, he's got a trail of suspensions that started in the 2nd grade.
He will be really combative for certain things. It's a struggle. It's a struggle to, to see your child go through this and you can't help him.
Alycia says the loss of a close family member caused Keyshawn's problems early on. Support comes from Danielle, who works with the Student Advocacy Center of Michigan in Ypsilanti. Recent data reveals more than 100 pre-K children, kids younger than the age of 5, have been suspended from Michigan schools in just 1 year.
For the first time, I had an expulsion case with a 1st grader, and here's this little kid, he kind of had a speech impediment, and trying to help him. Someone had said, "I'm going to kill you," on the playground, and so he was scared, and so he had brought a knife to school. He never had any intent to use it. He actually wasn't expelled, by the way.
Rules, generally speaking, are rules. Weapons, drugs, and fighting carry mandatory penalties. It's zero tolerance, dating back to the 90s, when nationwide we got tougher on crime in the streets and weapons in our schools.
The problem is that over time, zero tolerance laws have been expanded in Michigan and other states to include things other than weapons and that have room for subjective enforcement.
More zero tolerance rules meant more suspensions for other offenses, like insubordination and disrespect. When the ACLU crunched the numbers, they found more African Americans were getting suspended compared to whites.
In some of these school districts, African American kids are 3, 4, 5 times as likely to be suspended and expelled, and there's no evidence that they're actually engaging in more misbehavior.
Experts say the suspensions come in part because of a clash of cultures, where often white teachers are less able to connect with black students.
And this is all complicated by lots of other things, right? So we have cutbacks in school funding that mean that kids are having less recess, less physical education. There are schools in Detroit that have no gym and no playground. So what are those kids doing? You know, their recess time is walking around the school inside.
It's shown with just 1 suspension, a student is more likely to become a dropout.
Where once behavior would be considered naughty or something that needed to be corrected, now those behaviors are seen as criminal and something to be punished. When people talk about the school-to-prison pipeline, that pipeline is really built on the fact that we've criminalized so many behaviors that used to be thought of as naughty.
In Lansing, bills are in the works intended to loosen the zero tolerance rules, but that's only a start. In the classroom, more commitment is needed to work with individual students to avoid more suspensions.
I've spoken with teachers who have said, but if the kid is misbehaving, I have to punish him. And I say, why? What if you spent an extra 15 minutes building a relationship with that child, or you spent some time trying to figure out why he or she is having such a hard time?
In Keyshawn's case, his mother and his advocates still have high hopes for the new school year.
Research shows that students are much more likely to graduate and be successful academically if they have even one person who is going to continue to work with them through their journey, to not give up on them.
Danielle says if he can build some better relationships with a couple of teachers, maybe he just might stay in school and buck the trend of becoming just another statistic.
Wow, that really raises a lot of interesting discussion points about the relationships that our students have with their teachers, the relationships the students have with their parents at home, and how important it is that all of those things are linked together. And joining me now to talk about that are Ivy Bailey, the interim president of the Detroit Federation of Teachers, and Charlonda Buckman. She is the CEO of the Detroit Parent Network. And ladies, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here, and I think it's a really interesting discussion. Obviously, you represent a large segment of Detroit teachers and Detroit parents, but I really believe this is a conversation that parents and teachers around the state of Michigan can have, and you're representative of. So let me start with you and taking a look at the school year. Ivy, I want to start with you. Talk to me a little bit about how teachers are feeling right now in the new Detroit Public Schools District and what they're kind of sensing so far.
I think the teachers are hopeful with us. I think for us, sometimes we think of it as a same day, different name. But there is a sense of hope now with the teachers in Detroit Public Schools. We're hoping to see some changes. You can't change the school system's name and continue to do things as you've done before. You know, it can't be business as usual. Something has to change. I do know there are some new programs, and the teachers who are participating in those programs are very excited. There's a Montessori program, there's an Arabic language program, and so they're excited about those changes, but we're expecting to see a lot more.
Charlonda, what are parents talking about when they're talking about the beginning of this school year here in the city?
Well, beyond getting beyond the shock that we're actually back into the school year, most of us have just been in a little bit of shock, but somewhat anxious. I think definitely wanting a much better school year than we had last year. It was very turbulent, probably one of the most turbulent school years that we've actually seen. You know, with less teacher sick outs and student sick outs, but also with teachers in the classroom who are qualified in those subjects to teach with the tools they need to teach their children. I think parents are, you know, really frustrated because there's still issues that aren't different than what we learned earlier this year when we surveyed hundreds of parents across the city, and that is they're concerned about safety inside the building, outside the building. They're concerned about transition, lots of transition in the principal ranks, but especially in the teacher ranks. And we have to all do our part to create a stable situation for our kids. And so I think anxious to see what this school year is going to bring. It's not fair for a kid to have a different teacher in their subjects every other month.
And how would you address that, Ivy? Is that happening inside the classrooms?
I think this year the union has pushed, and Mrs. Meriweather has agreed to us do leveling earlier this year, because you know, you hate to be a teacher, you know, and I'm speaking from a teacher's point of view, you hate to sit in front of a group of children and then 2 months later, you're moved from those children. You've created relationships, and those kids expect you to be there. So the whole leveling process, we have schools that have a low number of students with enrollment, and then we have other schools who are over class size. So we plan on doing that earlier this year, than, you know, sooner than later.
So would you say the continuity in the classroom is so important to a child's success?
Oh, definitely, definitely. We actually have some parents who moved their child with a teacher. I mean, that's how great the relationship is between a teacher and their student.
Absolutely, and the relationship is critically important. One of the things that I do want to lift up that I think is a promising practice that's continuing to happen is a parent-teacher home visitation program. It's a national model that we brought to the district. In the last few years, we've been able to prove that parents and teachers working together, teachers actually visiting parents in their homes, sitting down, asking the question, what are your hopes and your dreams for your child for the school year, and setting goals accordingly. In 3 years, we've seen academic gains, we've seen better behavior management, and this year we're talking with parents also about attendance so we can push back on that issue.
You know, and that's what I wanted to strike to, because so many times when we talk about the success or the failure of our schools and we look at test scores and say, well, are things going very well? You get people who will point, well, it's the teachers. We've got to hold the teachers to a higher standard. And then you have people say, well, it's parents. If the parents would just be more engaged and more involved with their kids. So how would you, I guess, address that criticism or address some of those conversations about the partnership between teachers and parents and the importance of it?
Yeah, and I think it has to be a partnership. It cannot be just one or the other. The teacher and the parent has to work together. The students have to see that they're on the same page. You know, if I, as a teacher, have certain expectations, the parent also has to have those same expectations.
How do you engage those parents, though, who maybe
say, through conversation.
I think there has to be different strategies. I think we have to be more creative and open, starting with the premise that parents do care about their children. We hear people starting from a different place all the time, but we have to realize we bust children, not parents, and we don't bust children adequately. We're in a motor city where a lot of parents still don't have a motor vehicle, and many kids don't go to school in their neighborhoods anymore. That's just a thing of the past. And so when we think about those type of impediments, we have to think about things that we use in everyday business world. Why not set up conference calls to create a winning position for parents to be able to call in? We have parents that are working a couple different jobs who have children in multiple schools across multiple systems. And so, but we continue to do things the way we always did them when I was in school, in a neighborhood school, and my mother could walk 2 blocks.
Are we asking too much of teachers? Are we asking them to take on too much in the classroom, not only the academics, but maybe social issues that they've got to deal with kids that are coming from different backgrounds?
We're asking a lot of teachers, and I think what we've done in the negotiations, something that we've done different, we have asked the district to partner with us to create what we call community schools, and not just after-school program. We're talking about a complete wraparound services of where the school is the hub of the neighborhood. We have to change how we do business. You know, we have to look at that neighborhood and see what that neighborhood, what the needs are in that neighborhood, and we have to bring those things into the school.
Absolutely.
You know, and that means having school open to 8 o'clock at night, then we have to do that. But I think when you create those hubs, I think it will bring more parents in, and parents have to feel that they can come into a school. They have to feel welcome.
And
yes.
that's one of the things that we lift up as a parent organization early on in the school year, developing a relationship with your child's teacher, giving them whatever intel you have that's going to make them more effective at teaching them, but also understanding what that teacher is expecting. So I know my daughter Helena has to read 30 minutes every night. That's something I control as a parent. I think the other early evidence of how community schools actually work, and there are lots of models across the country, but the work that we did in the parent resource centers, we were able to bring in a myriad of partners who were able to help provide those wraparound support services and push back on things that teachers had been having to deal with, whether it is you know, grandparents raising grandchildren, having to figure out how to resource that family. We were able to strike up a partnership with Gleaners Food Bank and move hundreds of thousands of pounds of food into homes. And so those are the kinds of early examples of how we know that model can work. It's about getting to it.
You know, before we leave this conversation, Avi, I have to ask you, last year, Detroit teachers made national news because of the sick-outs and exposing, I think, a lot of the problems with the buildings with DPS. I think a lot of parents are going to be wondering, what can they expect this year? Do you anticipate any kind of action like that again?
I don't anticipate it, but I think what people need to understand is that teachers are their children's advocates. We're advocates for those children. Those are our kids. When they come to school, we feel like they're our children, and you know, we couldn't continue to allow what was happening in the schools to, you know, like cover it up. It's just like when you have company come over and you fix up the house and everything and make it look good, and we were doing that every day for our students. But you know, it got to a point where you couldn't continue to put the Band-Aid on it. You know, things were falling apart.
But and students got the shortest end of that stick, because we had parents showing up with their kids, very concerned, not necessarily having a plan A or B, not having a kind of job where they can just call in.
And there's the tough balance there.
Right, and there is a balance.
And you had students who said, I had a test to take this week, and I don't know what's going to happen. I'm supposed to graduate this year. And so students, and being able to lift up those stories around how this was impacting children, parents are champions for children, and parents were frustrated, obviously conflicted because they support their teachers, but at the same time, they're champions for their children. And this was about how this was hurting their children.
Yeah, but I also have to push back on that, because a lot of parents supported the teachers. I mean, who wants their child in a school where there's rats and roaches? Who wants their child in a school where the ceiling tiles are falling in? So I think a lot of parents did not realize some of the things that were going on in the school, because we covered them up. And I think once the parents understood what was going on, you know, and no teacher wants to harm a child, but how far are you supposed to, how long are you supposed to sit back and allow these things to happen before you speak up for your students?
And the other side of that is a lot of young people will not be able to march in that line because they won't qualify for jobs to be teachers. And so don't get me wrong, I'm all for unions. I'm a Detroit girl, support all of that. But teachers, those jobs our kids won't qualify for because they're not getting the education that they're entitled to. It's adults' job to fix this.
All right, Charlonda Buckman from the Detroit Parent Network. I encourage people to go ahead and check out your website, programs to help parents become advocates for their students. Ivy Bailey from the Detroit Federation of Teachers, thank you so much for joining us. You know, as part of its year-long project, the Detroit Journalism Cooperative received funding from the Knight Foundation to conduct a survey on race relations and racial attitudes. And the poll of 600 Michigan residents also asked about education-related issues. And here's a look at the results.
Education and crime are the top concerns of the Metro Detroiters who were surveyed by Lansing-based Epic MRA. 23% ranked both of these issues as the most important in the region. There was no marked difference between African Americans and whites. All agreed education and crime concern them the most. 12% of respondents said they worried more about the state of the economy and the outlook for jobs. Answers were split along racial lines when it came to a question about local schools. Nearly 60% of whites were satisfied with the quality of their local schools, compared to only about 30% of African Americans who were pleased with their neighborhood schools. Almost 70% of blacks expressed dissatisfaction with the schools in their communities. Only a small number were undecided. Just under 40% of whites weren't happy with their local schools. When it came to Detroit public schools, the majority of those polled rated the district as fair to poor. Less than 20% felt that the district schools are excellent or good.
Margin of error of plus or minus 4%, and those surveyed lived in Wayne, Oakland, and Macomb counties. All right, let's go over to Nolan and his guests. Nolan?
Thanks, Christy. Well, I'm here with Chastity Pratt Dawsey from Bridge Magazine and Aaron Einhorn from Chalkbeat Detroit. And we're going to talk about first this lawsuit that was filed earlier this month on behalf of 7 Detroit students by the pro bono law firm Public Counsel out of California. And basically it charges that the governor and the state of Michigan has denied children in Detroit, these 7 children, and by extension their peers, their constitutional right to literacy. They're trying to establish a constitutional right to literacy. Aaron, let me start with you. What is the significance of this lawsuit?
I guess it depends on whether or not it's successful.
Sure.
Obviously, you know, lots of people can file a lawsuit, but this lawsuit was obviously very, very carefully thought out. The firm behind it is a national firm. They were looking for an opportunity, I think, to bring a case like this because there are schools, not just in Detroit, but around the country that aren't serving children very well. And I think if this case is in fact successful, it could affect the way schools are funded, the way they're managed, the way they're operated in big cities all around the country.
And I mean, some of the evidence cited in this case, Chastity, it's just shocking. I mean, not just the conditions in the schools, which the lawsuit talks a great deal about, but also about the literacy levels of the children in the schools. And we're sitting here in really an education palace. Castex, a beautiful school. This recital hall is fabulous. We're thinking about MiWeek doing our spring recital here. It's so magnificent. But you've been in other schools in Detroit that don't look like this.
It runs the gamut. You know, Detroiters gave the school district $2 billion over the past 20-some years to fix up schools. So you have schools like Cass and DSA and Renaissance, and they're really nice, and Gompers, I mean, lots of them, but not all of them. You have schools where they're really in disrepair, and quite honestly, even the new schools and the ones that have been prepared are in some disrepair. You can go around Cass and find some issues because during all of these years of deficit, they've not had the staffing to maintain the buildings, to maintain the fixes, to maintain the repairs that the Detroit residents invested in over the years.
But it's not just the condition of the buildings.
Right.
The lawsuit does talk a lot about that, but also what goes on in the buildings. And it's pretty damning. I mean, basically they say these kids are getting very little, if any, real education. And they talk about children who have, 3rd graders who have vocabularies of no more than 400 words. And it cites, of course, the governor for not paying attention, but what's going on in these schools that the performance is so poor and these children are getting such little education?
It's an absolute indictment of the entire system from top to bottom. And it goes to the heart of what we've known since 2009 at least. Detroit Public Schools are performing the worst among big city schools across the nation. And why is that? What's really going on? I mean, they named it. I mean, you have everything from, like Ivy was saying in the last segment, roaches and rats and things of that nature in some schools. But you have a real lack of just rigor and real just achievement. The achievement gap here is bigger than you'll see anywhere else.
It sounds like nobody really cares about these kids.
Well, the state took over several times since 1999. The state is supposed to care, which is why they are straight and center, the target of this lawsuit. And people are already talking about Supreme Court. This can go all the way. This could be the big one, the one that everybody, this is, you know, the Moby Dick for all the civil rights education activists across the country. And we had just this week, the governor signed this, just today, wasn't it? They sent the bill to him for 3rd grade literacy.
Yes.
I don't know how that could impact the whole right to literacy lawsuit, but it's all tied together. And if this goes to the Supreme Court, everybody in the country is going to be looking at this.
And Aaron, it probably is eventually get to the Supreme Court. And you've talked to some legal experts about its prospects. Cases like this have failed in the past. The Supreme Court in '73 ruled that education was not a right. But there are folks who think this case has a chance.
I saw an interview with a Harvard constitutional law scholar who called this He said Brown versus Board of Education was the first shoe, and this is the next shoe to drop. So Brown versus Board of Education made it illegal to deliberately, to make legal segregation impossible. But this case is arguing that segregation has occurred and inequality has occurred by the way that we've structured our schools. And if that argument is successful with the Supreme Court, it could have extraordinary implications.
And we think of this as a Detroit suit. But if literacy is a constitutional right in Detroit, it's a constitutional right everywhere, all across Michigan and all across at least the Sixth Circuit if they prevail in district court.
Absolutely. And I mean, the court doesn't, the case doesn't spell out any particular monetary demands. They're not particularly asking for certain, X amount of dollars. What they're saying is every child needs to learn to read. And if every child isn't learning to read, then the state isn't doing its job. And there's a number of ways to measure that, but I think looking at, test scores, looking at, as you were saying, a few hundred words of vocabulary, you could make the case that, in fact, children aren't learning to read.
And Chastity, that is sort of the basic building block. If we're trying to get these kids fluent in all of these subjects and testing them on M-step in it, if they can't read.
At some point, they say third grade reading is the key indicator, because after that, you're reading to learn. You're reading to learn social studies, to learn math, to learn science. You have to know to read to learn those other subjects. And we know here in Michigan, we're 41st out of 50 states.
All right, Chastity Pratt Dawsey of Bridge Magazine, Aaron Einhorn of Chalk Beat, thanks for being with us today. Back to Christy.
All right, thanks, Nolan. As our schools become more diverse, it's important that students and teachers become more aware of racial, cultural, and ethnic differences. In Oakland County, teachers are going to class to learn how to better relate to their multicultural students. Go ahead, take a look.
With diversity comes difference, right? With difference comes conflict.
It's 1 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon in West Bloomfield, Michigan. School is in session, but this class isn't for students. This class is for teachers.
To me, to say that we have an achievement gap, particularly when we're talking about students of color and poverty, as opposed to there being something inherently wrong with the system that educates these students.
We are inside a cultural competence training session, which is designed to develop understanding and effective methods for teachers. They become more familiar with identifying and solving unintentional culture clashes within the shifting landscape of the diverse student population.
We're becoming aware of things that we either weren't able to see or we're able to ignore in ways that we can't do anymore. The more a teacher is aware of how these issues are brought into the classroom, the more effective the teacher can be in maximizing student learning.
In the past decade alone, West Bloomfield's African American population has soared 120%. Nationally, the 2014-2015 school year was the first time in America's history that white students in public schools were not the racial majority.
The demographic shifts are no longer coming. Diversity is no longer coming. It's here. They know when they walk in that school and or when they walk in certain classrooms in that building, they have to park parts of their culture in the hallway or on the street because it's not welcome in the building.
Dr. Jay Marks is an educational consultant of diversity and equity for Oakland County Schools. He trains teachers in the district of the importance of multicultural proficiencies in the ever-evolving school environment.
Students of color, African American, students Hispanic, Latino, and students of poverty are disproportionately placed in special education and remedial courses compared to their white and Asian peers who are disproportionately placed in advanced placement, honors, and college prep courses.
Creating best practices for educators to become culturally responsive, benefiting the students as well as the teacher.
We just don't know enough about one another. And when we don't know enough about one another, we don't gain understanding. In the dynamics of difference, these are cultural differences that sometimes that could lead to conflict.
By many census accounts, the racial demographic of this country will shift by 2040, and those who identify as white racially or ethnically will be the racial minority in this country. This training allows educators, many of whom are traditionally middle-class European American females, to bring awareness of differing cultures, ethnicities, and diversities into the classroom.
Can you teach students who don't look like you, who don't love like you, who don't walk like you, who don't pray like you, who don't live like you, effectively?
What we are asking teachers to do is we want to create kids who are ready for a global society. And that's all of our kids, because they're going to have to negotiate a culture that's very different.
By exploring the importance of cultural training, these instructors are introduced to new strengths in addressing issues arising from cultural situations.
It's an interesting challenge to be a privileged white middle-aged, middle-class plus guy with a diverse group of students.
So these workshops help reinforce how you can apply it in the real life situation, in the classroom, in the real world.
The training empowers educators with a hypersensitive perspective of teaching methods and philosophies, leading to increasing conflict resolution and identifying misunderstandings.
It reminds me that I need to really look at the holistic aspect of encountering the student as an individual, as a person who has a set of different backgrounds.
By focusing on the 5 skilled areas, awareness and acceptance of differences, knowledge of the student's culture, self-awareness, dynamics of difference, and adaptation of skills, teachers exploring hidden bias and colorblindness, which can lead to disproportionality in the way they instruct individual students.
Culture competence leads to more effective teaching because we begin to embrace culture. We begin to acknowledge it. We begin to accept it. We begin to understand it so that we can embed it in our teaching and practices.
By meeting the cultural needs of the students, instructors can continue to close the holistic equity gap for the betterment of the entire student.
Success would definitely be when students can walk into a school and feel welcomed, feel valued and included. When they can have a schooling experience that honors who they are, honors their experiences, honors their beliefs, validates them as human beings.
Skillman Foundation, Armen Hratchian of Excellent Schools Detroit, Veronica Conforme of the EAA, and Charlonda Buckman of the Detroit Parent Network. All right, so we have you back here on stage, and we've got a great studio audience here at Cass Tech High. And so let's go to the first question. Hi, ma'am, what's your name?
I'm Sherry Wells, and I just read the new law for the 3rd grade reading, and I want to know if everyone really is going to be prepared to do that. Teachers know who's having problems reading. It's got too many tests in there. It does have the whole community involved. Is it going to be funded? And is it going to succeed without flunking kids?
Thanks so much for the question. And you're talking about, of course, the new legislation that was passed saying that if a child is below the 3rd grade reading level by 1 grade, that they should be held back and not graduate on to the next grade. Victoria, I'm going to let you answer that. Veronica, excuse me.
Yes. So a couple of things I think need to be understood. The first thing is that this doesn't go into effect until 2019-2020. I think that it is incumbent on all of us who support schools, who work with schools, to really look at reading intervention programs that are working effectively and help teachers and support them in the development of those reading intervention programs. Because without that implementation, we're not going to succeed. It is important that every child reads. I also think that 3rd grade is too late. Early childhood is extremely important on this issue. If we don't have word development and play and all of the things that expose our young students to be able to successfully read by the 3rd grade, we're also not going to get there. So we need both funding and support around early childhood and support around reading intervention in 1 to 3.
Does anyone else want to pick up on that real quick before we move
Yeah,
to the next question?
it's actually
Go ahead,
disturbing that that when you think about it happens in 2019, people see that and they say, oh, we're going to finally deal with this issue, when you're really not. And that means that we've lost 3 more years. And so just recently we joined with Public Counsel to support students who are actually suing on their own behalf. The fact that literacy is a basic building block of education, and even in this context, we don't get it right. The fact that many of our schools and our children in Detroit don't have books to take home. And so how do you begin to address literacy when we don't even have books for our students? So I think there's a lot of frustration. I listened to a parent tell a story about how her daughter is a high achieving student, gets a 4.0. She takes copious notes and she takes pictures of pages because she is determined to do well in school. But it's not fair that she has to come up with a stopgap measure for her own education versus taking that same ingenious and being able to go deeper in her subject. So this is a major issue, and 2019 is not sufficient.
And it's going to take resources. Let's go to the next question. Hi, sir, what's your name?
Gene Cunningham.
Okay, go ahead, and what's your question?
I'd like to know how much money from the state school aid fund is being used to subsidize economic development in the city's tax increment finance area.
Well, that is maybe a question that we can't particularly answer here on this panel, and we're going to have to maybe take that for a larger discussion about economics. So let's go to our next question. Sir, what's your name?
Hi, my name is Ishmael Ahmed. I'm a candidate for the State Board of Education.
Okay.
Early education is fundamental, and also parenting programs, but they're not universal in Michigan. What can we do to move that ahead?
Tonya, I'm going to let you handle that. What do you think that we can do to make those programs more universal for early childhood?
It's really simple. We just need to invest. I mean, it has to be a decision. I think one of the things that Nolan said at the beginning of the program is that our state is not an education state. It's not an education state. We're not investing. Many of the states, even though we've increased our early childhood investments overall, it's not enough. We need to make sure that there are programs that are available in every single school district across the state. And we also need to make sure that parenting programs are available to these families. And when you talked about the third grade reading, I would just lift up that they're not really financing that support. Now, we know schools need to do a good job at that, but why are we penalizing the children because we have a broken education system across the state? So we got to take a more holistic look at this and really do the investments that we need, that we know will give these kids the right building blocks.
Is it in terms of we've got to reprioritize some of our funding or put it in different places?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, so one of the things the gentleman just asked about financing, part of it is that we're now taking higher ed funding out of our state aid budget. Now, that was never the case, and it never should have been the case. We need to be able to figure out how we're going to finance both and prioritize those things. If we wanted to get rid of maybe investing so heavily in prisons, that would give us some room in our budget.
All right, let's go to the next question. Hi, ma'am, what's your name?
Marty Wilson.
Okay, Marty.
My question is, you discussed an importance of the relationship between a student and the teacher. I want to know, what advice do you have for a parent whose daily conversation with their child is, my teacher isn't there, I don't have a teacher, or my teacher left for a better opportunity in another district?
Charlotte, I'm going to let you take that.
And it's very frustrating. It's the very thing that we dealt with last school year with lots of transition of teachers and children not being able to bond appropriately with their teacher. And I would say if that is a condition of your school, honestly, I have to answer how I'd answer for my kid. Take your kid and move them to a place where they're going to be able to develop relationships and bond and have all the conditions that we want as parents for our kids to be successful, not knowing who your teachers are. Kids know when they're getting the short end of the stick. They're articulating to you now, Mommy, this isn't working. I don't even know who I can connect to. And so that is a moment where parents have to act. We are champions for our children. We have to make a decision to say, hey, let me get you out of that environment, because they don't know what to do, but they know enough to tell you what's not happening. And so I would say look at, there are a number of schools in Detroit who are doing a good job. Excellent Schools Detroit produces a whole report card around schools who are getting these kinds of conditions right, and I think it's worth taking a look at that and figuring out how to get your kid in a place where they know who their teacher is.
All right, and we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much, and we're going to kind of finish up our show. I'm going to leave our panel here and head back over to Nolan and Stephen as we wrap up our live show here on education at Cass Tech. I know we haven't had a chance to be together this this entire show.
We've all been very busy.
All right, Nolan, I want to talk to you a little bit about the takeaway from tonight and some of the things that we've heard. What are your thoughts?
Well, I still go back to what we said in the beginning. There are promising things going on in education in Detroit and in Michigan, but there are a tremendous amount of challenges, and we've got to commit to meeting the challenges, and we've got to commit to a one-state approach to reforming education. That's what's working in other places. We don't have that here. We need it.
Okay, so I go back and say, all right, who's in charge then? Who's that person who's supposed to go and do that one approach?
It's part of the problem. We've got both a governor in charge of education and a state board in charge of education, a state school superintendent. My solution would be to put the responsibility under the elected governor, make the education board a department under the state, and give him the accountability. If it works or doesn't work, it's on him.
All right, Stephen, thoughts?
Yeah, I think the discussion about Detroit and the upcoming election, how pivotal that is, how important that is to making this new reset work, that's everything. That's only, what, 6 weeks away, so.
Yeah. All right, well, we'll look forward to getting to know some of the candidates and going from there. All right, thanks, guys. And that is going to do it for this special live broadcast of My Week. Thanks so much for joining us. As always, you can find us during the week on Facebook and on Twitter. And for all of us at Detroit Public Television, I'm Christy McDonald. We'll see you next time for My Week. Take care, and thanks to our audience here tonight. Thanks.
From the moment you wake up till you turn out the light, MASCO is proud to be part of your everyday life. When you turn on the faucet for a cool drink of water, open a kitchen cabinet to set the family table, or freshen up a room with a new coat of paint, you do it all with MASCO products. MASCO and its family of companies, serving Michigan communities since 1929.
Did you know Roush Enterprises was selected by Google to assemble a test fleet of 100 prototype self-driving cars in 2015? It also produced the new Domino's delivery cars. And speaking of Domino's, Domino's sells well over 2 million pizzas per day around the world, and half of their sales are digital. These are just some of the ways Michigan's pioneers started out as small companies with big ideas.
We are business leaders for Michigan. We are committed to making Michigan a top 10 state for jobs, personal income, and a healthy economy. Funding is also provided by Delta.